The story begins with an arid landscape. It's the Afghan desert, and an American military tank pierces through it. Back in black plays, both in and out of the movie. Inside the tank, Tony Stark displays his amicable and sarcastic sense of humor, surrounded by army members. A soldier asks him for a photo, but before anyone hits the flash button, a bomb explodes right beside their tank. Tony is petrified and disassociates quickly. The army soldiers enter full battle mode and leave a Tony Stark alone. He loses his grip of what's happening around him as another bomb blasts next to him. Dust and debris cover the sunlight, and Tony feels briefly relieved for wearing a Stark Industries body vest. The next thing he knows, he awakens confused, sweaty, hurt, and surrounded by men heavily armed and speaking Urdu, a language he doesn't understand. The bright lights burn his eyes as he begins to get a hold of what's going on. He's a hostage, and the men speaking Urdu are recording a video. Behind them, a red and black flag. That's Mandarin's flag, but Tony doesn't know the dangers that are coming his way. Flashback a few hours, and we meet a completely different scenario. A ball full of elegant and sparkly people, toasting at the evening's honoree, Tony Stark, who isn't there. Obadiah Stane, his right hand at work, receives the prize on his behalf, and apologizes for Tony's absence due to work. Tony Stark shows himself in a completely non-working situation. He cheers at another win at a casino. His bodyguard and friend, Happy, just follows him around. Tony amazes his audience as the performer and entertainer he is. As he leaves the casino, Christine Everhart, a reporter for Vanity Fair, approaches the brick wall of bodyguards he has around him. She confronts him with sharp questions about the warlike nature of his industry, hoping to catch him off guard. He gives her the complete opposite, his usual funny and vague answers, until he lectures her on the relevance of his work. The verbal standoff ends up in Tony's humongous bedroom in his Malibu mansion. Christine awakes with the AI voice filling the air. That's Jarvis, Tony's tailor-made AI assistant. Pepper Potts, his human assistant, greets Christine and shows her the exit door with a pinch of passive aggressiveness. Tony Stark's eccentric ways are not for everybody, so he keeps his distance from everyone whenever he can. Pepper Potts is one of the few human beings that not only understands him, but also accepts who he is. Their chemistry is clear as Tony works on his rare car and Potts advises him on some work-to-do lists. Potts, Happy, and Rhodey are the closest thing to friends he has in his life at this moment. An impatient Rhodey waits for Tony on a jet, but he's always late. The work trip is nothing out of the ordinary. The Stark Industries team arrives at their destination, Afghanistan. It's time to launch their latest and most efficient weapons of war. Tony Stark is thrilled and makes an emblematic presentation of the Jericho at the barren and dry scene. The team wraps up, and Tony heads back to the American base to go back home. But this time, the trip doesn't go as smoothly as it usually does. Tony is caught up in the middle of a bombardment and taken hostage in a dark and forsaken cave. Never in his lifetime has he been so disoriented as he is now. The shock and disbelief spike when he sees himself attached to wires, connected to a car battery. He's gone through an improvised surgery, and the battery is the only thing keeping shrapnel from piercing his heart. A friendly man, Yinsen, explains to him the delicate surgery procedure, but their awkward conversation stops when an Afghan warlord enters the room with his goons. The fearful Tony Stark doesn't quit his arrogance, and meets an equally ruthless opponent, Anguish. He's taken outside, carrying his battery. Yinsen translates the warlord's bossy speech. To his surprise, Tony realizes the Afghans have a ridiculous arsenal of Stark weapons. He can't understand, but keeps refusing to help the Afghans until Yinsen talks him out of the giving up speech. Something inside Tony's mind clicks, and he runs his work plan, but he's not working on his tormentor's plan. Rather, he's putting together a way to keep himself alive and get out of that cave. Yinsen doesn't seem to understand his plan, and that's when Tony explains it to him. He's assembling an armor fueled by the improvised arc reactor that will break him out of captivity. Tony looks stronger after installing the arc reactor in his chest. He and Yinsen finally have a moment to breathe and be friendly. Their break time is up when his tormentor feels something is wrong with the pair of scientists. The leader of the Afghan team threatens the chuckling men, who are now on a tight deadline to deliver a brand new Jericho. However, instead of doing what he was told, as usual, Tony makes what suits him, a body armor that will break them out of there. The plan is bold, and leads the unconventional pair of scientists to their breaking point. It's now or never. Ultimately, Yinsen sees no other way out for Tony, and risks his well-being to buy him some time. Tony gets ready before anything more serious happens to Yinsen, and his breakout plan commences. The perpetrators of his hell on earth are given a taste of Tony's brilliant mind, as he faces them wearing the giant iron armor. At this point, Yinsen perishes, and says goodbye to Tony, who still has a chance of saving himself. Tony manages to set the entire camp on fire, but struggles to escape. The battle is at full speed, and Tony bets his last card. He tries to put on his armor to fly away from there. He doesn't go far, but it's enough for Rhodey to rescue him in the middle of the desert. He lands in the U.S. to an emotional Pepper Potts, who jokes about his comeback saving her job. He immediately briefs her on his next steps, a cheeseburger and a press conference. Tony gives a heartfelt opening speech that quickly turns into the most devastating interview for Stark Industries. Tony Stark is shutting down the weapon manufacturing division indefinitely. Obadiah Stane freaks out, but at that point, he knows the arc reactor works. Speaking of which, Tony is now downstairs in his home lab, asking for Pepper's helping hand to work on something. He tells her to replace the decaying arc reactor with the latest version, but the task is delicate, and she freaks out a bit. The comic moment shifts when Tony thanks her and tells her she's the only person he has. On a failed attempt to get Rhodey's help, Tony gets frustrated with his visit to the military base. He tries to convince Rhodey to partner up with him on his secret project, but Rhodey wants nothing to do with this new anti-war Tony. Minute after minute, he realizes he doesn't have many minds to count on. So far, he has only Pepper Potts and Jarvis to share his plans with. Back home to his lab, then, time to work. The more Tony works on a new version of the armor that got him out of captivity, the more his tormentors look for the remains of the junky machine in the desert. The prototype testing went worse than expected, but Tony is relentless and works on improvement. He can finally feel in control of his groundbreaking project, and is clearly more confident in his plan. Against Jarvis's will and advice, Tony takes the new suit for a test drive outside his compound. It looks like the 15-year-old inside of Tony got the best of him, and he faces the first fiasco outside his workshop, and crashes the suit into his mansion, from the roof to the basement floor. After the traumatizing hostage experience, Tony acts like his life now relies on the consequences of his epiphany after the breakout operation. Little by little, he questions the relevance and depth of certain habits he used to have, but he also knows how hard it is for an old dog to learn new habits. It almost breaks his heart to learn on the news that he's throwing a party and hasn't been invited to it. That can't happen, and the old dog is back to business, at least for a night. He dazzles everyone at the party, including the also dazzling Pepper Potts, and leaves Obadiah on the brink of cardiac arrest. Christine from Vanity Fair spots him in the crowd, catches Tony before he has time to run. From the unpleasant encounter, Tony finds out that Obadiah has been secretly working on the weapon division, and confronts him. Obadiah gives him a glimpse of his true colors, but they know that it's Tony's name on the building, and he's the one who will be accountable for the catastrophe. Enough of test drives. Tony takes his pristine red and gold suit on a mission. The city of Gulmira, where Yinsen and his family were from, is besieged by the men who captured him. Tony gives them a full display of power on his first mission abroad with his secret project. On the other hand, his flight back home doesn't go as planned, and Rhodey is on his tail. Tony is forced to confess he is the unknown flying object. Rhodey is conflicted between his duties as a colonel and as a friend, but Tony manages to save himself, again. On the other side of the planet, the Afghan criminals have to answer to their sponsor, who happens to be the one and only Obadiah Stane, who reveals his failed plot, the demise of Tony Stark once and for all. He's the one in charge, not the Afghans, as we thought. Tony's plan to fly back involves the loyal Pepper Potts, who needs to get classified information from the Stark Industries database without raising any red flags. She's a resourceful woman, that's for sure, otherwise, she wouldn't have lasted long as Tony's right hand. Pepper Potts can barely breathe, but enters the office in stealth mode and works her way into the company's database. Pepper finds videos, photos, and blueprints that place Obadiah Stane in the eye of the tornado, but now she's running out of time. Obadiah surprises her in Tony's office, and even to her own shock, Pepper puts on her best poker face and goes with the flow as Obadiah stalls. She leaves carrying a flash drive packed with information and evidence that frame Obadiah. He's suspicious and finds out that she downloaded several files from the company's database while they talked. Pepper Potts rushes out of the building and carries Agent Coulson with her as a way out. He's been desperate to meet Tony Stark and talk to him about a classified operation he's running with the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement, and Logistics Division. He doesn't understand what she's doing, but follows her anyway. Obadiah feels humiliated and outplayed by Potts, so decides to humiliate some staff members to reassure his authoritarian personality. Meanwhile, at home, Tony experiences some new feelings, like the blues of loneliness, and thinks of Pepper, wishing she was there with him. As a trick of fate, his phone rings, and it's Pepper, but before he has the chance to say hello, a sharp sound pierces through his eardrums and paralyzes his body. The pain and powerlessness bring the traumatic memories of captivity to the surface, and there's nothing he can do. To add to his utter shock and disbelief, Obadiah reveals himself as the villain of his tragic recent story. As Tony lays down, completely petrified, Obadiah refuels his engines with power drawn from his cowardly actions. Obadiah plucks Tony's arc reactor out of his chest and delivers his evil guy speech as he does it. Tony agonizes, in pure desperation. The icing on the cake for Obadiah is to mention that Tony has put Pepper in harm's way. That's the last straw for Tony. Back at Stark Industries, Pepper assembles her own task force to save Tony Stark. Rhodey and Agent Coulson are part of it, and they sprint to his mansion. Back home and completely alone, Tony fights the paralysis to get down to his lab. He has only a few minutes left, and needs the arc reactor. The silly little robot he has in his lab helps him. Rhodey arrives shortly. Pepper Potts is driven to unmask Obadiah and have him arrested for trying to destroy Tony and everything he has created. She doesn't consider the consequences of her efforts. Pepper, Agent Coulson, and their team carefully enter Obadiah's secret department, where he develops his destructive plan. Pepper loses her grip and storms out of the building, trying to escape. She fears that's the end of her. Cutting through the air, Tony Stark sprints to Stark Industries to fight Obadiah and save Pepper. Tony dives in from the dark sky and strikes Obadiah's armor down. The two Tin Men cause destruction on the streets. Chaos is inevitable. Citizens are everywhere and running for their lives. It seems like there isn't much Tony can do with his inexperience as a fighter. Obadiah crushes him down. Tony and Obadiah take the fight up to the skies as Rhodey keeps control of any air activity. The only thing Pepper can do is watch. Tony lures Obadiah high, up to the point where his armor can't avoid getting frozen. That's Tony's leverage now as Obadiah nosedives. Obadiah is too strong to defeat wearing only a suit. Tony gives Pepper orders to blast the central reactor. It's the only way to put him down for good. Even horrified with fear, Pepper trusts Tony and does as she is told. She doesn't feel very hopeful, though. The David and Goliath battle escalates, with Obadiah winning. He can't escape Obadiah or the reactor. That's it for him. Pepper finally pushes the reactor button and blasts Obadiah down. The impact spills Tony out off the roof. He's unconscious and certain of his ending. Going against all odds, a new day shines, and Tony is back on his feet with Pepper by his side. He's getting ready for another press conference, this time about the incident at Stark Industries. The papers are desperate to know who's the man in armor that saved the day. Who is the Iron Man? Agent Coulson briefs Tony on a fake alibi to avoid attention going to him. Coulson's austerity overpowers Tony's arrogance, and he's forced to say that Iron Man is his bodyguard and nothing more. Tony and Pepper are closer than ever, but nothing happens between them, to Tony's frustration and Pepper's delight. It's time for Tony to do what he was told and convince the reporters that Iron Man is his bodyguard. Once again, Christine from Vanity Fair gets him upset and confused. Tony perspires and gags, trying to stick to the script. He's experiencing the peak of his internal conflict to continue to be the irresponsible billionaire who aims at making more money at people's expense, or to risk it all by being who he knows he is supposed to be. He's made his decision. He faces the cards, takes a deep breath, and says, "I am Iron Man." Before ending the whole thing, Tony has a final visit from a stranger that calls himself Nick Fury. Fury tells Tony he has no clue what he's getting into, and he would like to discuss with him the future of the world. He wants to talk about the Avengers Initiative.